government must establish the same criteria. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the member from Scarborough-Guildwood for introducing this piece of legislation and for his general concern for the citizens in developing countries. I thank the member while noting, I'm sure, with his agreement that corporate accountability for Canadian resource extraction companies can operate abroad is long overdue. We know that extractive industries are often able to take advantage of political cultures in developing countries that do not accept or respect our domestic principles of democratic accountability and transparency. Centralized decision-making at the executive level can offer extraction rights in exchange for capital in many developing countries, in many developing companies, can greatly infringe upon human rights and environmental sustainability of localized populations. Canadian companies, like those from other modern industrialized states, have at times taken advantage of political circumstances in their quest for new sources of revenue, to the gross detriment of workers and local communities, which have and will suffer the devastating environmental consequences for generations. I was sad to see that just this week a lawsuit was filed against a company listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange for their alleged involvement in human rights abuses at a mining concession site in Ecuador. I'm sure that all members, current and past, from this House will agree that legislation that enforces international rights standards and environmental best practices upon Canadian companies operating abroad is long overdue. Now, the member from Scarborough-Guildwood will know that New Democrats have long stood in this House in support of corporate accountability as a principle of international trade and economic activity among and between nations. He'll also know that it was the former honourable member from Ottawa Centre that first sought to enforce this principle with Bill C-369 in the 38th Parliament. Support from the New Democrat caucus on legislation that enforces ethical behaviour upon Canadian companies, including those operating abroad, has never been difficult to attain. As such, and given that this bill merely seeks to encourage such behaviour rather than enforce it, I can only offer my qualified support for it at this stage. This bill is an imperfect piece of legislation that is too narrow in its scope and application and too weak in its enforcement. If this member is truly interested in ensuring that companies apply environmental best practices and the protection of international human rights standards abroad, he will promote or surely encourage three very important amendments to this bill. First, the member should encourage an amendment to this bill that will see it apply to all corporations in Canada with operations abroad, and not just those receiving government assistance and that operate in extractive industries like mining and oil and gas. It is true that the very nature of extractive industries make violations of these principles all too profitable and tempting for many. But violations are also likely to occur and be reported in manufacturing, and agriculture, and other labor-intensive and environmentally taxing industries. And this would be, Madam Speaker, a very important amendment. Second, the member should encourage an amendment to this bill that ensures the principles contained in this bill related to environmental best practices and international human rights standards are enforced rather than simply encouraged. This could be achieved in this bill by adding a provision that amends the criminal code to punish the same undesirable behavior abroad as it does at home. Such a provision was contained in Bill C-369 from the 38th Parliament, if members wish to explore this possibility. Finally, the members should encourage an amendment to this bill that would create an ombudsman's office to help ensure the principles of this bill are respected and to investigate any claims that may be brought against companies with respect to the provisions of this bill. An independent ombudsman would help ensure that our domestic and international politics do not interfere in the promotion and protection of environmental best practices and international human rights by Canadian companies operating abroad, and would also assist the Minister, as well-intentioned as they may be, so they will not be exclusively burdened with monitoring and enforcement of these measures. It is important to note that this last amendment was called for in the advisory group report titled 2007 National Roundtables on Corporate Social Responsibility and the Canadian Extractive Industry in Developing Countries. I'd like to thank all members of the advisory group and all participants in the National Roundtables on Corporate Social Responsibility for their hard work, and encourage each and every member of this House to read their report and strongly consider their recommendations when deliberating this particular piece of legislation. And I'd also encourage the member from Scarborough-Guildwood to take a bold step by pushing for these 3 amendments, including the creation of an independent ombudsman to be attached to this bill at the committee stage. Madam Speaker, this Parliament represents a rare chance for real change on a number of fronts. If only members can muster the political will and courage to stand up in support of the principles they claim to respect and wish to uphold. This bill, for all its imperfections, is progress on the issue of corporate responsibility for Canadian companies operating abroad. Given that this bill can be amended at committee, I offer my support to it at this stage and thank the member for tabling it.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.